March 17, 1943, 9:40 hours. Terpitzufer 76-78. Berlin. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, chief of the Abwehr, adjusted his gloves as he leaned over a mahogany desk cluttered with intercepted reports. Outside, the Landwehr Canal reflected a cold gray sky, calm and indifferent. Inside, the atmosphere was anything but. Canaris had spent the morning reviewing intelligence fragments arriving from Mexico City, Madrid, Stockholm, and Lisbon. Individually, they were unusual. Together, they formed something impossible. He did not yet know that within minutes, he would read numbers that would quietly determine the outcome of the war, not through battle, but through industrial arithmetic that no one in Berlin was prepared to accept. At that moment, German leadership was certain of one thing. American production claims were exaggerated propaganda. Hermann Göring had openly dismissed earlier reports, insisting that the United States lacked the discipline and structure required for sustained war production. Their reasoning was built on experience. Germany had required 6 years of total mobilization, centralized planning, and forced labor to reach peak output. The Americans had entered the war only in December 1941. Therefore, any claim of large-scale aircraft production within 16 months violated every known industrial limitation. The conclusion seemed logical. It was also catastrophically wrong. On paper, the German intelligence system appeared comprehensive and effective. It included agent networks across neutral countries, diplomatic observers embedded in foreign industry, intercepted commercial and military communications, economic analysts tracking raw materials, technical officers verifying production feasibility, multiple independent human intelligence sources by all professional standards. This system should have produced accurate strategic conclusions. And it did. But accuracy alone was not enough. The report arrived in layers. First came conversations overheard in Mexico City. American businessmen casually describing a factory so large it generated internal weather patterns. Then came Spanish diplomatic observations confirming assembly line aircraft production. Swedish engineers reported 1,600 specialized machine tools operating simultaneously. Japanese intercepts added further confirmation. Each source, independent and unconnected, described the same phenomenon: continuous aircraft production at unprecedented scale. At first, analysts searched for inconsistencies. None appeared. Technical details aligned perfectly: engine specifications, assembly segmentation, workforce size, material consumption. The convergence of data eliminated the possibility of coincidence. Yet, instead of triggering alarm, it triggered resistance. Then came the number. Not dozens. Not hundreds. One heavy bomber per hour. 650 aircraft per month from a single factory, Ford's Willow Run plant. Each B-24 Liberator required 1.5 million individual parts, 450,000 rivets, and over 30,000 separate components assembled into an 18-ton machine. The assembly line stretched over a mile with subassemblies, wings, fuselage sections, tail units, moving simultaneously and converging at precise points. Production was not sequential. It was continuous. With each new report, the implications expanded. Intelligence summaries revealed 42,000 workers operating in multiple shifts, training programs producing 8,000 new workers weekly, aluminum consumption exceeding total German production, cost reductions per aircraft as output increased, workforce composition including 40% women and thousands of African American workers. The system was not just efficient. It was scalable beyond anything Germany had ever attempted. The problem became clear when comparing capabilities. Germany possessed highly trained engineers, centralized industrial control, experienced production systems, limited raw materials, dependence on precision manufacturing. The United States possessed vast natural resources, decentralized but flexible industry, assembly line mass production, expandable labor force, geographic immunity from attack, ability to convert civilian industry rapidly. This was not a difference in quality. It was a difference in magnitude. In that moment, Canaris understood what others refused to see. If even half of these figures were accurate, the war was already decided. Not on the battlefield, in factories, Production at this scale would generate air power that could not be countered, replaced faster than it could be destroyed, and sustained indefinitely. But understanding did not equal acceptance. Within the German command structure, the numbers were not treated as reality. They were treated as contradiction. And contradiction in a system built on ideology was not analyzed. It was rejected. The war had already shifted. Only Berlin had not yet realized it. March 17, 1943, 10:15 hours. Turpitzufer 76 to 78. Berlin. Major Friedrich Wilhelm Heinz stood rigidly at attention as Admiral Canaris slowly turned the final page of the compiled intelligence summary. The room was silent except for the faint ticking of a wall clock. Heinz had verified every number 3 times, cross-checking sources from 4 countries. Nothing had changed. The conclusion remained the same, impossible yet consistent. Canaris placed the document on the desk, his fingers lingering for a moment longer than necessary. Outside, Berlin moved as usual. Inside, the foundations of German strategic planning were beginning to crack. At that moment, German leadership remained confident in a single expectation. Even if American production was increasing, it would inevitably slow under complexity. Aircraft were not automobiles. They required precision engineering, skilled labor, and time-consuming assembly. German industry had proven this repeatedly. Their logic followed experience. Complex systems could not be simplified without loss of quality. Therefore, any claim of mass-producing heavy bombers at automotive speed had to be false or exaggerated. On paper, German industrial doctrine supported this belief. The system relied on highly trained specialists assigned to complex tasks, centralized production in controlled facilities, long training cycles for skilled labor, strict quality control processes, limited but precise output, engineering refinement over quantity. All projections indicated one outcome. Production would remain constrained by complexity. No system could bypass these limits without collapse. Then came the contradiction. Reports from multiple sources described a completely different method. Instead of skilled teams building entire aircraft, the Americans had fragmented the process into tens of thousands of individual tasks. Intelligence indicated over 60,000 separate operations per aircraft, each worker performing a single repeated action. Training periods reduced from months to days. Assembly lines moving continuously rather than static construction. Subassemblies produced simultaneously and merged at fixed points. This was not traditional manufacturing. It was industrial decomposition, breaking complexity into simplicity. The first signs of disbelief emerged immediately. German analysts attempted to identify failure points. Such a system, they argued, would collapse under coordination errors, mechanical breakdowns, or workforce inexperience. Yet no reports indicated such failures. Instead, the opposite appeared. Production rates increased as workers became more efficient through repetition. Then came the workforce data. Not thousands of trained engineers. Tens of thousands of semi-trained workers. Women, civilians, even individuals with no prior industrial experience. Intelligence reports described 42,000 workers operating in shifts, including approximately 40% women and thousands of African American laborers. Groups Nazi ideology classified as inferior or unsuitable for complex industrial work. This alone made the reports politically unacceptable. But the numbers did not stop there. Training programs were producing 8,000 new workers weekly. Tasks were simplified to the point where a single individual could master their function in days. Production did not rely on expertise, it relied on scale. The system compensated for individual limitations through repetition and volume. The scale of resources further intensified the contradiction. Reports indicated 16 million pounds of aluminum consumed monthly at a single facility, 3.5 million square feet of factory space, 1,600 specialized machine tools, continuous rail deliveries feeding production lines, synchronized logistics connecting multiple supply chains. These figures exceeded the capacity of entire German industrial sectors. The problem was no longer whether the reports were accurate. The problem was what they implied. Germany's system was optimized for precision under constraint. The American system was optimized for scale without constraint. One relied on control. The other relied on expansion. These were fundamentally incompatible approaches. The contrast between forces became increasingly clear. Germany had limited raw materials, restricted labor pools, centralized control structures, vulnerability to disruption, dependence on skilled labor the United States possessed, access to vast natural resources, expandable workforce including previously unused labor segments, decentralized industrial capacity, ability to absorb inefficiency through scale, continuous logistical support. This was not a difference in efficiency. It was a difference in industrial philosophy. The moment of realization began to form within the intelligence community. Officers like Hines and Ritter understood that the American system was not breaking the rules, it was redefining them. By removing complexity from the individual and placing it into the system, they had bypassed traditional limitations entirely. Yet within the command structure, this realization could not take hold. Accepting these conclusions required abandoning core ideological beliefs about race, labor, and industrial superiority. The system was not designed to adapt to such contradictions. Instead, it rejected them. In that moment, the first true failure occurred. Not of intelligence, not of analysis, but of acceptance. Germany was not losing information. It was losing the ability to understand it. March 17, 1943, 11:30 hours. Abwehr headquarters, Berlin. Admiral Canaris stood by the tall window overlooking the canal, the report now closed but far from resolved. Across the room, Oberstleutnant Nikolaus Ritter, head of air intelligence, waited with visible tension. Unlike many officers in Berlin, Ritter had lived in the United States for nearly a decade. He had seen American cities rise vertically in months, watched factories produce automobiles in minutes, and understood something others did not. The numbers in the report were not extraordinary. They were consistent with American industrial logic. At that moment, German command still held firm to a central expectation. Even if American production was increasing, it could be matched or countered through superior engineering and efficiency. German aircraft were considered technically superior, built with precision and craftsmanship. The assumption followed naturally: quality would compensate for quantity. A smaller number of better machines, operated by experienced crews, would balance any numerical disadvantage. On paper, this belief was supported by the structure of German industry. The system emphasized high-performance engineering and advanced design, skilled labor trained over long periods, centralized quality control, complex but optimized production processes, limited but refined output. All projections suggested that superior technology could offset numerical inferiority. This assumption had worked in earlier campaigns. It would not work now. The first cracks appeared through Ritter's analysis. After reviewing all available intelligence, he delivered a conclusion few dared to voice. If the American production figures were correct, Germany had already lost the war. His reasoning was not emotional, it was mathematical. Even if German aircraft outperformed Allied models individually, they could not overcome a production ratio that replaced losses faster than they could be inflicted. Then came the expansion of intelligence sources. Reports from Mexico City described American businessmen speaking openly about factory operations, unaware they were being monitored. Spanish diplomatic channels confirmed structured assembly line workflows. Swedish engineers documented machine specialization at unprecedented levels. Even intercepted Japanese communications independently verified that a single American factory exceeded national production elsewhere. Each source added detail. Each detail removed doubt. The scale became increasingly precise. 650 B-24 bombers per month at peak from Willow Run. Total American B-24 production exceeding 1,400 monthly. Assembly lines exceeding 1 mile in length. Synchronized subassembly integration across multiple production streams. Workforce exceeding 42,000 operating in continuous shifts. This was no longer an estimate. It was a measured system operating at full capacity. The contradiction intensified when examining labor composition. Reports consistently described a workforce that violated every principle of Nazi ideology. Women comprised roughly 40% of workers. African Americans operated complex machinery. Teenagers managed logistics operations. Tasks were simplified to the point where traditional skill hierarchies were irrelevant. Production did not depend on elite expertise, it depended on organized repetition. The implications extended beyond industry into ideology itself. Germany's system was built on assumptions of hierarchy, specialization, and controlled efficiency. The American system functioned on inclusivity, scalability, and redundancy. One excluded large portions of its population from industrial contribution. The other mobilized nearly all available human resources. The contrast between forces became unavoidable. Germany possessed technically advanced but limited production, restricted labor pools due to ideology, dependence on skilled specialists, vulnerability to disruption and bombing, finite resource availability the United States possessed. Industrial processes designed for expansion, workforce utilization across all demographics, ability to absorb inefficiency through volume, continuous raw material supply, geographic security enabling uninterrupted production. This was not a contest of machines. It was a contest of systems. The moment of recognition deepened within the intelligence community. Ritter and others understood that American production was not just larger, it was structurally unstoppable. Even successful German attacks could not reduce output below replacement levels. Destruction no longer equaled reduction. Losses became temporary. Yet within the command hierarchy, the response remained unchanged. Reports were questioned. Numbers were reduced. Conclusions were softened. Intelligence that contradicted ideology was not integrated, it was filtered out. The system protected belief over reality. In that moment, the failure expanded. It was no longer confined to disbelief. It became institutional. Germany still possessed accurate intelligence, but it had begun to lose the ability to act on it. April 20th, 1943, 14:10 hours. Hall, north of Berlin. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris stood in the vast hunting hall of Hermann Göring's estate, surrounded by mounted trophies and oversized furniture that reflected the Reichsmarshal's excess. Spread across a massive oak table lay photographs, shipping manifests, and compiled intelligence from months of investigation. Canaris had chosen this moment carefully, Hitler's birthday, when senior leadership was gathered. He did not yet know that within minutes, the most critical intelligence warning of the war would be dismissed outright, sealing a strategic blindness that could no longer be reversed. At that moment, Göring was certain of one thing. The reports were fabricated. His expectation was absolute. No nation could build heavy bombers at automotive speed. His reasoning followed ideology as much as experience. Aircraft required precision engineering, skilled labor, and time. The idea that untrained workers, women, and minorities could assemble complex bombers contradicted everything he believed about industry and race. Therefore, the intelligence had to be deception. On paper, Göring's confidence rested on German industrial assumptions. Aircraft required long assembly cycles measured in months. Skilled engineers were irreplaceable. Production errors would multiply in simplified systems. Workforce quality determined output quality. Centralized control ensured reliability. All calculations pointed to one conclusion. Mass production of complex bombers at hourly rates was impossible. Then came the evidence. Canaris presented it methodically. Aerial photographs showed assembly lines stretching across vast factory floors. Rail manifests documented aluminum shipments exceeding German national production. Reports from 17 independent sources aligned in detail and timing. Each piece reinforced the same conclusion: continuous production at unprecedented scale. The first cracks appeared not in the data, but in Göring's reaction. He did not analyze the evidence. He rejected its premise. Photographs were dismissed as staged propaganda. Production figures were labeled exaggerations. Material consumption data was questioned despite independent verification. Even when presented with raw numbers, 16 million pounds of aluminum consumed monthly at a single plant. Göring responded with ridicule rather than calculation. Then came the moment of escalation. Not dozens, not hundreds, one bomber per hour. Canaris repeated the figure clearly, supported by multiple sources. Göring's response was immediate and final. He declared the entire report fraudulent, insisting that the Americans lacked the discipline, skill, and racial composition required for such output. The conclusion had already been decided before the evidence was presented. The situation worsened as additional context emerged. Intelligence revealed factory workforce exceeding 42,000 workers, production broken into 60,000 standardized operations, training cycles reduced to days instead of months, continuous assembly lines replacing static construction, cost per aircraft decreasing as output increased. Each detail strengthened the conclusion. Each conclusion was ignored. The catastrophe deepened with scale. German analysts calculated that if even half the reported output were accurate, Allied bombing capacity would soon exceed all German defensive capabilities. Continuous bomber streams would replace isolated raids. Losses would be irrelevant if replacement rates remained constant. The contrast between forces became stark. Germany possessed limited industrial capacity vulnerable to bombing, restricted labor due to ideological exclusion, dependence on skilled specialists, finite raw material supply, centralized production targets. The United States possessed industrial systems designed for expansion, workforce mobilization across all demographics, access to vast raw materials, distributed production reducing vulnerability, ability to sustain continuous output. This was no longer a competition. It was a disparity of scale. The moment of realization occurred, but not where it mattered. Within the intelligence community, officers understood the implications fully. They saw the trajectory clearly: exponential production leading to uncontested air superiority, followed by industrial collapse under sustained bombing. But within leadership, belief overrode evidence. The final failure occurred in that room. Göring did not misinterpret the data. He refused to accept it. In that moment, Germany's strategic position shifted irreversibly. Not because the enemy had changed, but because reality had been rejected. The war would now be fought against numbers that Berlin had chosen not to believe. April 20th, 1943, 1840 hours. Wolfschanz, East Prussia. The briefing room was dim, illuminated by a single overhead lamp casting long shadows across maps of the Eastern Front. Adolf Hitler stood over the table, studying troop positions near Kursk as Admiral Canaris was ushered in. Around him were General Alfred Jodl, Wilhelm Keitel, and Joseph Goebbels, men whose decisions shaped the war's direction. The intelligence report was placed before them. Canaris knew that what he was about to present would not be judged by accuracy, but by whether it aligned with belief. At that moment, Hitler was convinced of one principle: industrial production had limits that could not be bypassed. His expectation was clear: complex weapons required time, skill, and discipline. Germany had spent years preparing for war, refining industry through centralized control. The Americans, in his view, lacked the cultural and organizational discipline necessary for such efficiency. Therefore, any claim of rapid aircraft production on a massive scale violated not just logic, but his entire worldview. On paper, Hitler's reasoning followed established industrial doctrine. The system relied on highly trained specialists for precision manufacturing, long production cycles for complex machinery, strict hierarchical control of labor, limited but refined output, centralized coordination ensuring quality. All projections indicated that rapid expansion would degrade efficiency. No system, according to this logic, could increase output exponentially without collapsing. Then came the contradiction. Canaris presented the figures directly. American production estimates for 1944 indicated 18,000 B-24 bombers, 12,000 B-17 heavy bombers, over 40,000 fighter aircraft, total aircraft production exceeding 80,000 units. Annually, these numbers exceeded anything previously recorded in military history. They were not projections, they were based on verified production trends already observed in early 1943. The first warning signs appeared in the room itself. Jodl began calculating silently, recognizing the implications. Even if the figures were reduced by 75%, the remaining output would still overwhelm German defenses within months. Continuous bombing at that scale would destroy industry faster than it could be rebuilt. Hitler interrupted before the calculation could be completed. The figures, he declared, were false. The reasoning was immediate and absolute. The United States had entered the war in December 1941. Constructing such factories and achieving such production within 16 months was, in his view, impossible. Complex machines could not be produced like consumer goods. Aircraft required craftsmanship, not repetition. The discussion ended before it began. Then came further evidence. Canaris referenced material consumption, millions of pounds of aluminum per month, exceeding German production. He described assembly lines operating continuously, workers performing single tasks repeatedly, and production cycles reduced dramatically. Each detail reinforced the same conclusion. American industry had fundamentally redefined manufacturing. The response remained unchanged. Hitler dismissed the system itself. He argued that mass production degraded quality, that inexperienced workers would produce inferior machines, and that such output could not be sustained. Ideology replaced analysis. The scale of the threat, however, continued to grow. Intelligence indicated factories operating multiple shifts with over 40,000 workers, continuous logistics delivering raw materials without interruption, training systems producing thousands of workers weekly, production costs decreasing as efficiency increased. Output accelerating rather than stabilizing. These indicators pointed to exponential growth, not temporary expansion. The catastrophe now moved beyond disbelief into strategic paralysis. German planning remained based on outdated assumptions. Air defenses designed for hundreds of bombers, not thousands, production targets insufficient to replace losses, fuel allocations based on limited operational tempo, industrial dispersion planned for manageable attack levels, strategic timelines assuming gradual escalation. Each assumption was already invalid. The contrast between forces became decisive. Germany possessed declining industrial capacity under bombing pressure, limited access to raw materials, shrinking skilled labor force, centralized production vulnerable to disruption, inability to scale output rapidly. The United States possessed expanding industrial infrastructure, virtually unlimited access to resources, scalable workforce including previously unused demographics, decentralized production networks, ability to increase output continuously. This was not a temporary imbalance. It was structural superiority. The moment of true realization occurred, but only among those who could not act. Jodl and other officers understood the implications clearly. If the numbers were accurate, the Luftwaffe would be overwhelmed, industry destroyed, and the war lost through sustained bombing alone. But within the highest level of command, that realization was rejected. In that room, the final barrier collapsed, not of information but of acceptance. Germany now possessed accurate intelligence, verified by multiple independent sources, supported by economic data and technical analysis. And yet, it would not act on it. The war would continue, not because victory was possible, but because reality had been denied. November 1943, 21:10 hours. Abwehr Headquarters, Berlin. In a locked room with curtains drawn, Admiral Canaris and his deputy Hans Oster stood before a projector. The film had arrived through Swiss intermediaries, smuggled inside diplomatic pouches routed through Spain. It contained only a few minutes of footage, but those minutes showed what no report could fully convey. A camera moved along an assembly line stretching beyond visible range. Aircraft advanced in steady intervals. Workers, men, women, black, white, performed synchronized tasks with mechanical precision. A clock visible in the frame confirmed the pace. One bomber nearing completion as another entered final assembly. Canaris did not yet know that this evidence, more definitive than any document, would never reach Hitler. At that moment, German leadership still believed that visual evidence could be fabricated. Their expectation remained unchanged. Even if the Americans attempted mass production, such complexity would inevitably break down under coordination errors. The reasoning was rooted in German experience. Large-scale industrial systems required strict control, and any deviation introduced inefficiency. Therefore, even if the film was real, it had to represent an isolated or staged example, not sustained production. On paper, German analysis continued to rely on familiar constraints. The system assumed coordination failures would disrupt assembly line flow, unskilled labor would reduce output quality, Machine specialization would create bottlenecks. Supply chains would fail under continuous demand. Production rates would stabilize or decline over time. All projections suggested that such a system could not sustain high output without collapse. The film proved the opposite. Every element functioned continuously. Subassemblies arrived in precise sequence. Workers performed single, repeated tasks without interruption. Aircraft moved forward at fixed intervals, indicating a stable production rhythm. There were no visible delays, no signs of breakdown, no interruptions in workflow. The system was not fragile, it was resilient through repetition. Then came the realization of scale embedded within the footage. Not dozens, not hundreds, continuous flow. The camera revealed multiple aircraft in different stages of completion, spaced evenly along the line. This spacing, when measured against time, confirmed the reported production rate. The impossible number, 1 bomber per hour, was not theoretical. It was operational. As the implications expanded, additional intelligence reinforced the visual evidence. Reports indicated parking facilities for over 12,000 vehicles, confirming multi-shift operations, rail networks delivering constant material supply, dozens of completed aircraft visible at adjacent airfields, synchronized logistics connecting external factories to final assembly, continuous operation across day and night cycles. The system was not localized. It was integrated into a broader industrial network. The catastrophe deepened when economic analysis was applied. German analysts calculated that the capital investment for Willow Run alone approached $200 million. Half the total investment of the entire German aircraft industry over more than a decade. One factory was operating at a scale comparable to a national system. The contrast between forces became overwhelming. Germany possessed fragmented production across multiple vulnerable sites, dependence on skilled labor concentrated in limited numbers, restricted capital investment, supply chains vulnerable to disruption, production rates constrained by complexity. The United States possessed massive centralized facilities designed for scale, distributed supply networks feeding continuous production, ability to invest resources at unprecedented levels, workforce expansion without ideological limitation, systems designed for uninterrupted operation. This was no longer a difference in capacity. It was a difference in industrial reality. The moment of final understanding occurred in that darkened room. Hans Oster reportedly whispered a single phrase, "It's true." Canaris did not respond immediately. Instead, he reached for a lighter. Within seconds, the film was burning. The decision was not emotional, it was calculated. Presenting this evidence would not change leadership's mind. It would only expose those who accepted it. In that moment, the failure became irreversible. Germany now possessed undeniable proof of American industrial superiority, visual, measurable, and verified. And it chose to destroy it. The war would continue, not because the truth was unknown, but because it was unaccepted. February 20th, 1944, 10:25 hours. Central Germany, Luftwaffe Sector Command. Radar operators reported formations approaching from the west, their signals merging into a single mass that blurred across the screens. Within minutes, visual confirmation followed. The sky darkened not from weather, but from aircraft. Wave after wave of heavy bombers advanced in tight formation, escorted by long-range fighters. Luftwaffe pilot Adolf Galland would later report seeing over 800 bombers in a single formation, a scale that defied previous experience. What had been debated in reports for a year was now visible overhead, impossible to deny. At that moment, German command still believed one thing. Even if Allied bombing increased, German defenses could adapt. The expectation was that concentrated fighter interception and anti-aircraft fire would impose losses severe enough to reduce operational tempo. This belief was based on earlier engagements, where heavy bomber formations suffered significant casualties without escort support. The assumption was simple: bombers were vulnerable, and sustained losses would limit their deployment. On paper, German air defense remained formidable. The system included over 10,000 anti-aircraft guns defending key industrial zones, radar-directed interception networks coordinating fighter response, experienced Luftwaffe pilots with years of combat experience, fortified production facilities designed to withstand bombing, Centralized command structures controlling air defense operations. All projections suggested that even large bombing raids could be contained through coordinated defense. Then came the break in expectation. The bombers did not arrive alone. Long-range escort fighters P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts accompanied the formations deep into German airspace. This eliminated the primary weakness of earlier Allied operations. Intercepting fighters were now engaged before they could reach bomber formations. Loss ratios shifted immediately. The first signs of collapse appeared within hours. Reports from multiple sectors indicated interception formations disrupted before reaching bombers, fighter losses increasing beyond replacement rates, anti-aircraft fire unable to compensate for reduced fighter effectiveness, bomber formations maintaining cohesion despite heavy fire, targets struck with increasing accuracy and consistency. The system designed to repel limited raids was now facing sustained, protected assaults. Then came the scale. Not hundreds, thousands of aircraft over multiple targets simultaneously. Operation Argument, later known as Big Week, involved over 1,500 heavy bombers and hundreds of escort fighters operating across multiple days. German defenses were forced to respond continuously, exhausting both pilots and equipment. Aircraft losses mounted not only from combat, but from operational strain. The catastrophe accelerated rapidly. Within 6 days, Allied forces dropped more bomb tonnage than had been used during entire earlier campaigns. German aircraft factories, critical to replacing losses, became primary targets. Production facilities were damaged or destroyed faster than repairs could be completed. The escalation exposed deeper weaknesses. Reports indicated pilot training hours reduced due to fuel shortages, replacement aircraft delivered without experienced crews, maintenance capacity overwhelmed by continuous losses, fuel production facilities targeted and degraded, operational readiness declining across all Luftwaffe units. The Luftwaffe was no longer losing battles. It was losing its ability to function. The contrast between forces became decisive. Germany still possessed advanced aircraft designs, experienced but diminishing pilot corps, defensive infrastructure under increasing strain, limited production capacity, shrinking fuel reserves. But the Allies possessed overwhelming numerical superiority, continuous aircraft replacement capability, long-range fighter escort eliminating bomber vulnerability, stable fuel supply enabling sustained operations, industrial capacity supporting indefinite expansion. This was no longer a contest of air power. It was a demonstration of industrial dominance translated into combat. The moment of realization spread unevenly through the command structure. Frontline commanders understood immediately. Reports shifted from tactical descriptions to strategic concern. The language changed from resistance to inevitability. The Luftwaffe could no longer defend German industry effectively. Yet, at the highest levels, acceptance remained incomplete. Losses were acknowledged, but causes were misinterpreted. Production increases were ordered, despite declining capacity. Strategic adjustments were delayed. The system continued to operate under assumptions that were no longer valid. By the end of February 1944, the outcome had become clear to those willing to calculate it. German aircraft losses exceeded replacement rates. Industrial damage reduced future output. Fuel shortages limited operational response. Meanwhile, Allied production continued to increase. The equation had shifted beyond recovery. In that moment, the consequences of earlier disbelief became irreversible. The intelligence ignored in 1943 had now manifested in full operational form. The numbers had become reality, and reality could no longer be dismissed. The war in the air was no longer being fought. It was being decided. June 6, 1944, 5:30 hours. Normandy coast, France. German radar stations lit up with signals so dense they blurred into a single mass. Observers along the Atlantic Wall stepped out of bunkers and stared at the horizon. What they saw defied comprehension. The sea itself appeared to move, covered entirely with ships. Battleships, destroyers, landing craft, transports, stretching from horizon to horizon. Within minutes, the first reports reached command. An invasion force of unprecedented scale was approaching. At that moment, German command still held one critical expectation. Any Allied landing could be contained and repelled within hours. The belief was reinforced by years of preparation. The Atlantic Wall, stretching over 2,400 miles, had been designed specifically to prevent such an invasion. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel himself had inspected defenses, concluding that any landing force would be destroyed on the beaches before it could establish a foothold. On paper, the defensive system appeared formidable. It included 58 divisions deployed across Western Europe, millions of mines laid along likely landing zones, thousands of fortified bunkers and artillery positions, overlapping fields of fire covering beaches, anti-tank obstacles and barriers in tidal zones, coastal artillery capable of delivering sustained firepower. All calculations indicated one outcome: an invasion would be crushed before it could succeed. Then came the first disruption. Weather reports had predicted storms would prevent any landing. German meteorologists assured command that conditions would remain unsuitable for weeks. Based on this assessment, key commanders were absent. Rommel had returned to Germany. Senior officers were away from their posts. Naval patrols had been reduced. The system was confident and unprepared. The first reports began to contradict expectations. Radar detected large aerial formations. Paratroopers were reported landing across multiple sectors. Communications became confused. Some units reported British forces, others American. Dummy paratroopers added further chaos. The pattern did not match any known operation. At first, it appeared to be deception. Then came the scale. Not dozens, not hundreds, thousands of ships. The Allied invasion fleet consisted of nearly 7,000 vessels, over 1,200 warships, more than 4,000 landing craft, hundreds of auxiliary and transport vessels. It was the largest amphibious invasion force in history. German observers, raised on propaganda describing Allied weakness, struggled to process what they were seeing. The situation escalated rapidly. At 5:35 hours, naval bombardment began. Battleships fired massive shells at coastal defenses. The USS Texas alone fired over 250 heavy shells within minutes. British battleships delivered similar barrages. German bunkers, designed to withstand heavy fire, began to crack under sustained bombardment. Reports from the front showed fortifications collapsing under continuous naval fire, communication lines destroyed, defensive positions buried and re-excavated repeatedly, artillery crews unable to maintain sustained response, psychological shock spreading among defenders. The defensive system, designed for controlled engagement, was overwhelmed by scale. The contrast between forces became immediately apparent. Germany possessed fortified defensive positions, trained infantry units, limited artillery support, constrained ammunition supplies, reduced air support due to fuel shortages, but the Allies possessed overwhelming naval firepower, continuous air superiority, unlimited logistical support, ability to land reinforcements continuously, coordinated multi-branch operations, land, sea, air. This was not a balanced engagement. It was an asymmetrical assault. The moment of realization came gradually along the coastline. Individual defenders reported the same phenomenon. No matter how many enemy units were destroyed, more continued to arrive. Every destroyed landing craft was replaced by several more. Every suppressed position was targeted again by naval fire. The system designed to repel a single assault was facing an endless flow. By midday, German positions began reporting critical shortages. Ammunition calculated for days of combat was exhausted within hours. Artillery fire was reduced to minimal levels. Supply routes were cut by Allied air attacks. Reinforcements could not reach the front in time. The defensive plan had failed, not because it was poorly designed, but because it was designed for a smaller war. The scale had changed, and Germany had not. June 6, 1944, 16:20 hours. Normandy, sector between Caen and the coast. Major Hans von Luck, commanding elements of the 21st Panzer Division, stood beside his command vehicle as delayed orders finally arrived. For nearly 10 hours since the initial landings, his armored units had remained immobilized, awaiting permission to act. Now, at last, the command came, advance toward the coast and counterattack. He did not yet know that this delay, measured in hours, had already made the outcome irreversible. At that moment, German command still believed one thing: armored reserves could restore the situation. The expectation was clear: if panzer divisions struck the beaches before Allied forces consolidated, the invasion could still be thrown back into the sea. This belief had been central to Rommel's strategy. Tanks, deployed rapidly and decisively, would destroy landing forces before they could establish depth. On paper, the counterattack plan appeared viable. The system included elite armored units positioned within operational range, Panzer IV and Panther tanks capable of engaging Allied armor, mechanized infantry supporting breakthroughs, artillery units providing covering fire, operational doctrine emphasizing rapid concentration of force. All calculations suggested that a timely counterattack could fracture the invasion front. But the plan depended on one critical factor: speed. And speed had already been lost. The first breakdown appeared in command structure. Orders required approval from the highest level, Hitler himself, before armored divisions could be deployed. This delay, combined with confusion from airborne landings and disrupted communications, prevented immediate response. By the time authorization arrived, Allied forces had already secured multiple beachheads. Then came the operational reality. German armored units advancing toward the coast encountered conditions they had never faced before. Reports indicated continuous air attacks on all movement routes, roads blocked by destroyed vehicles and bomb craters, communication breakdowns between units, difficulty coordinating movements under constant observation. Delays compounding with every kilometer advanced. The battlefield was no longer contested space. It was controlled space. The scale of opposition became clear as units advanced. Not isolated forces. Continuous reinforcement. Allied troops were landing in waves. Fresh units arrived faster than German forces could engage them. Naval gunfire targeted any concentration of armor. Fighter bombers attacked columns in transit. Every movement was detected and engaged. The counterattack began, but under impossible conditions. German units reached the coast near Lyon-sur-Mer and Luc-sur-Mer by approximately 1900 hours. For a brief moment, they achieved what no other armored unit had done that day: they saw the sea. But what they saw confirmed the scale of the problem. The invasion was not slowing. It was expanding. The escalation reached its peak that evening. At 2100 hours, German forces observed a new development. Hundreds of gliders descending behind Allied lines. Operation Mallard delivered reinforcements directly into combat zones. To German commanders, this appeared as a new threat to their flanks, forcing them to withdraw. The counterattack collapsed not from defeat, but from impossibility. The contrast between forces was now absolute. Germany possessed limited armored reserves delayed by command structure, constrained fuel supplies, vulnerability to air attack, restricted mobility, inability to reinforce quickly. But the Allies possessed continuous troop landings, absolute air superiority, naval artillery capable of targeting any movement, airborne reinforcements behind enemy lines, logistical systems sustaining uninterrupted expansion. This was not a battle of maneuver. It was a battle of scale. The moment of realization came too late. German commanders on the ground understood that even successful local actions could not change the overall situation. Every destroyed Allied unit was replaced within hours. Every advance exposed units to overwhelming firepower. The system they faced was not a force, it was a flow. By nightfall, the outcome was effectively decided. The beaches had not been cleared. They had been secured. The invasion had not been stopped. It had begun to grow. And for the first time, German commanders understood that they were no longer fighting to win. They were fighting to delay the inevitable. June 26, 1944, 1830 hours. Cherbourg, France. General Lieutenant Karl Wilhelm von Schlieben stood in the ruins of a fortified port city that had been prepared for 4 years to resist exactly this moment. Concrete bunkers shattered, artillery positions silenced, communication lines severed. Around him, 21,000 German troops, once expected to hold for months, were exhausted, disorganized, and cut off. Within hours, he would surrender. He did not yet know that this moment would confirm what German intelligence had already proven over a year earlier. The war had been lost not on the battlefield, but in production figures that had been ignored. At that moment, German command still clung to one final expectation: that prolonged resistance could stabilize the front. The belief remained that delaying Allied advances would stretch their logistics, create vulnerabilities, and allow Germany to regroup. This assumption was rooted in earlier campaigns, where rapid advances often outran supply lines. The expectation was simple: time would weaken the enemy. On paper, the strategy seemed plausible. The system relied on fortified defensive positions across France, remaining armored divisions capable of counterattack, interior lines allowing redeployment, expectation of Allied logistical strain, belief that extended operations would reduce enemy tempo. All calculations suggested one possibility: prolong the fight and opportunities would emerge. But the reality had already shifted beyond that logic. The first sign came through logistics. Allied forces were not slowing, they were accelerating. Reports indicated artificial mulberry harbors supplying continuous reinforcements, over 15,000 tons of supplies delivered daily within days of D-Day, pipeline systems delivering fuel directly from Britain, transport networks operating without interruption, replacement units arriving faster than losses occurred. The expected logistical collapse never came. Then came the scale of reinforcement. Not reinforcements. Expansion. By mid-June, Allied forces were not sustaining their position, they were growing exponentially. Entire divisions were landed, equipped, and deployed within days. German units, by contrast, struggled to move at all. Air superiority turned every road into a target. Rail lines were destroyed. Movement became exposure. The catastrophe intensified with time. Reports from German command revealed units requiring weeks to reach the front instead of days, armored divisions losing up to 30% of vehicles before engagement, supply shortages affecting fuel, ammunition, and food, communication breakdowns isolating units. Continuous Allied pressure preventing regrouping. The system designed for maneuver warfare was immobilized. The contrast between forces became absolute. Germany possessed shrinking manpower reserves, collapsing logistical networks, limited fuel and ammunition, fragmented command structure, inability to replace losses. But the Allies possessed uninterrupted supply chains, industrial capacity replacing losses instantly, complete air and naval dominance, coordinated multi-front operations, expanding operational tempo. This was no longer a contest of armies. It was a collapse against a system that could not be exhausted. The moment of full realization came gradually across the command structure. Reports shifted in tone. Commanders no longer spoke of counterattacks, they reported survival. Units once considered elite began to withdraw in disorder. Even experienced formations, including paratroopers, reported psychological breakdown under continuous pressure. The final collapse came in August 1944. The Falaise Pocket became the graveyard of German forces in Normandy. Between August 12th and 21st, approximately 10,000 German soldiers were killed, 50,000 captured, over 300 tanks destroyed, more than 2,500 vehicles lost, entire formations ceased to exist. Roads were filled with destroyed equipment and abandoned vehicles. Air attacks struck continuously. Escape routes became killing zones. The war in Normandy ended not with a single battle, but with systemic destruction. By the end of August 1944, German losses in the campaign reached approximately 320,000 casualties. Allied forces, despite significant losses, continued to advance with uninterrupted reinforcement. Every loss was replaced. Every advance strengthened their position. The conclusion was unavoidable. Germany had not been defeated by a single operation. It had been overwhelmed by scale. The final insight was clear, though understood too late. This war had become a war of production. Factories had replaced battlefields as the decisive front. And in that war, Germany had been defeated long before the first Allied soldier set foot on the beaches of Normandy.